All right, let's get this screen sharing going. I guess I have to share my screen with you all first so that you can actually see it when I put it up there. So, even when you've done this before, there's a lot of things to keep track of. There we go. All right, Tamara, can I get a quick thumbs up if you can see my screen?
I can. You are not in slideshow mode, but.
Okay. We good?
Yes. Now you're good.
Excellent. Like I said, it doesn't matter. It's still new. It doesn't matter that it's been 6 months. All right, so everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for our Collecting Current History webinar. I'm going to take just a quick little bit and introduce myself and introduce everyone who's here, whose lovely faces you see on the right-hand side of your screen. And then we'll go in a little bit to introducing you to Zoom so that you know what functions are available to you, and then we'll get going. So my name is Karen DePau, and I am the Manager of Local History Services at the Indiana Historical Society in Indianapolis, Indiana. So for any of you who aren't familiar with the Local History Services Department, what we do is we provide assistance to organizations throughout the state of Indiana, and luckily through webinars to anyone who wants to sign up for them, because I know not all of you are Indiana folks who are on here. So we do trainings of all types. We offer assistance through fundraising training, collections care training. Tamara gets to do super fun stuff with board trainings and strategic planning. There are 4 of us in our department, myself, Tamara, who you'll hear from in just a moment, Jeanette Rooney, who is our assistant director, and she does a lot with marketing, social media, exhibitions planning, exhibitions design, things of that nature. And then we have Bryce Gorman, who is on our team thanks to a grant from the Lilly Endowment Incorporated. And he does a lot of our fundraising and also heads up our Heritage Support Grant fundraising opportunities. If you're in the state of Indiana, that is unfortunately an Indiana specific program we offer, but if you're in the state of Indiana and you're interested in our grants, you can head to indianahistory.org/grants, and that'll take you right to that page. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. I do most of our collections type trainings. That's my area of expertise. So I'll be doing the Collecting Current History webinar today. And then I'm going to throw it over to Tamara to do a quick introduction of herself, because she's going to be lurking in the background. So it's nice to know who's there.
Hi, everybody, and welcome. I'm Tamara Hemmerlein. I'm the Director of Local History Services at the Indiana Historical Society. And my role today is monitoring the Q&A and chat boxes. So if you have any questions or technical difficulties, please let me know, and I will do my best to troubleshoot and fix things. But as I said, I'll also be looking at the Q&A and chat boxes for any content-related questions you have. So welcome and enjoy.
And then Mary, if you want to give a quick intro of yourself, because you'll be hearing from Mary a little bit later on in the presentation.
Sure. My name is Mary Gervitz. I'm an archivist here at the Indiana Historical Society. I'm on this presentation just to give you a quick case study of a project that we're working on here. And otherwise, I process large-scale collections and serve as a mentor for our interns and volunteers here in our Library and Archives department at the Historical Society.
Excellent. Thanks, Mary, and we will hear from you in a little bit. All right, so before we get started, I wanted to point out really quickly a few things about the Zoom webinar platform we're using in case any of you are new to it. So please do note that we are recording this webinar. So everyone's entering the webinar with both their microphones and videos muted. There will be time for questions at the end of the webinar, but feel free to type them in at any time. There are 2 different options for questions depending on who you're asking. So if you're interested in submitting a question to the presenters, please use the Q&A function for that. Also through that function, you can submit a question anonymously. So if for some reason you're a little unsure about it, you can totally do that there. If you would like to hear from your fellow participants, you want to use the chat feature because that will allow everyone to kind of respond and have conversation off to the side, mention resources, things of that nature. So if you all want, if you feel compelled to do so, if you want to introduce yourselves in the chat really quickly while we're kind of going through this, it's a nice little way to get introduced to that feature. So if you would like to hear from both your fellow participants and the presenters on a question, I do encourage you to put that question in both the chat and the Q&A. Tamara will be monitoring for questions throughout the program, but there's always a chance with the chat, if the chat actually gets going, that the actual original question will get lost. So just make sure to plop it over in the Q&A as well if you're interested in hearing from the presenters on it. So as I said, Tamara will also be monitoring throughout. So she will kind of be taking note of questions. And if she feels like it's something that she needs to interrupt us for because the explanation and answer to the question will make a difference on your ability to understand the rest of the presentation, she will interrupt us. Otherwise, like I said, we'll do questions at the end, which is very weird for me. I am very much a conversational presenter. I like to do questions as we go through, but with a webinar, that doesn't really work quite as well because I'm not that great at multitasking, at presenting and watching questions and all of that at the same time. So now let's get to the fun stuff. So I always like to start workshops and webinars by outlining the objectives at the beginning. This helps you to know what to expect from the webinar as we move forward. There are quite a few avenues we could go down on the topic of collecting contemporary and current history, but it would take more than a single webinar. So here's kind of what you can expect from today. By the end of the webinar, I hope you will know how to build a collecting initiative around a rapid response that allows for fast but thoughtful collecting. Understand the historical importance of collecting all sides of an event or story, regardless of the organization's beliefs. There's a big difference between having a neutral collection and having neutral values. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're also going to talk a little bit about communicating your initiative to the public. And hopefully, last but not least, I hope that by the end of this webinar, you feel empowered to do this. I know when COVID first started, there was kind of a little bit of a panic of wanting to rapidly gather information about this unprecedented historical event that we're all living in right now, but also some insecurities about how to do this and can we do this, and you know, what if we're a small museum, how do we do this? So hopefully by the end of this, you will feel like you are just as empowered as any one of the big guys to go after such a collecting initiative. So what do we mean by collecting current history anyway? Although it's difficult to prepare for all the possibilities of the future, it is possible to prepare how you might collect them. There are 2 ways to think about collecting current history. There is the constant effort of making sure that the organization's collection does not put a stopping point on history and has a collection that reflects the history of, quite literally, yesterday. So we want to avoid having collections that only represent history as things that happened at least 50 years ago. But there's also the idea of collecting current history as it relates to unexpected current events that happen suddenly and provide sometimes a very short window of opportunity to collect items as the event is unfolding, rather than waiting a generation or 2 and just hoping that something about it walks through your doors. I know a lot of us have kind of felt that tug of wishing we had collected in, say, 1918, something about the flu, so that we could pull it out in 2020. So hopefully having a rapid response idea and a concept of this collecting current history will help make sure that in 100 years, if heaven forbid another pandemic happens, that people won't be cursing the names of all the curators right now or the collections managers who didn't accept anything about COVID. So collecting current history generally requires a level of proactivity that we're not used to from a collecting standpoint. In order to best capture a current event, it's helpful to actively collect while the event is happening or soon after in the aftermath. This means that we must go out, sometimes physically, into our communities and collect the items as they're literally being tossed aside. So collecting contemporary items allows you to get the story directly from those who used or created the item instead of trying to piece it together years later. It's also important to note that the idea of collecting current history is still relatively new in the museum field. So there are holes in the process that we're still trying to figure out as a field. So you might see some of that in this presentation, but hopefully we can get a conversation going, because the best way to fill those holes and figure that out is to just start doing it and taking note of and having conversations with our colleagues about what's working and what didn't work. So Indiana's bicentennial is a really great example of kind of collecting current history. The photograph that's here is a picture of 2nd and Main Street in Vincennes, Indiana, that was taken in 2016, which was the year of Indiana's bicentennial. So the bicentennial was a celebration we knew was coming. We could plan for it so that we could collect it in the moment rather than waiting generations for things to hopefully walk through the door. It was primarily about contemporary collecting, but it also had elements of a rapid response collection. So these are two different terms that have some slight but important differences. So we're going to break them down for you and talk a little bit about how they're the same, how they're different, because it is important to kind of know about those differences. So both terms, contemporary and rapid response collecting, deal with current history, but they do have slightly different connotations. So it's like the fact that all squares are rectangles, but not all rectangles are squares. All rapid response collections are contemporary, but not all contemporary collections are necessarily rapid response. So contemporary collecting is, in short, the idea that items offered to the museum should not be turned away just because they're deemed not old enough. It is the constant act of remembering that history happened as recently as yesterday, and that our collections should reflect that. They shouldn't stop after World War II. When we look at items offered to our collection, we should really look at age as not the only determining factor, but just one of many. So we should really consider how the object fits the entire mission, vision, and collecting policy of our institutions when we're considering it, and not just turn it away because it's from 3 days ago and not from 50 years ago. So with contemporary collecting, it's really about recent history. It's usually a little bit easier to plan for. So with our example of the Indiana bicentennial, we knew that was going to happen in 2016. It was always going to happen in 2016 because of when we were founded. So we could actually plan for how we were going to collect that in the moment. Contemporary collecting in general tends to be a little less fraught, or not necessarily fraught. You know, everyday items from yesterday are not that fraught with, you know, opinions and whether or not it was a good thing or a bad thing. So, you know, it tends to be a little bit easier because it's just about not using age as a negative factor. But there also, you can be a little bit more passive when it comes to contemporary collecting. You might not necessarily be seeking out contemporary items, but it's the idea of also just not turning them away just because they walked through your door and they're a little newer than older pieces. So that's sort of contemporary collecting in a super nutshell. Rapid response collecting, however, on the other hand, is often seen as a much more proactive and is usually connected to an event or instance that is sometimes still happening while it's being collected. There's often a feeling of urgency associated with rapid response collecting, which can make it feel really stressful. Sometimes we can help mitigate by being really prepared for the unexpected, or at least as prepared as we can be. So rapid response collecting really tends to be even more in the moment history. Sometimes it's something that you have a very limited amount of time to collect. It's much harder to plan for. You know, none of us planned for a pandemic in 2020, but there were things that we could sometimes think about that might help in the future. There's a much higher potential for a rapid response collection to be more contentious or just more emotionally fraught, kind of depending on what type of rapid response or what type of event has caused the rapid response. It also usually requires a very proactive approach. So again, because you usually are looking at something that has a much smaller time frame of when you can collect the items successfully, you have to sometimes go out there and be proactive in a way that we're not used to doing with collections. Usually, I think most of us are used to sitting back on our laurels and collecting or cataloging the things that are already in our collections and just waiting for someone to walk something new in the door instead of actually going out and asking for that new thing. So one example of kind of the difference is, you know, something like contemporary collecting is just realizing that an item from the 2017 annual Thanksgiving marathon might have the same historical significance as an item from the 1978 annual Thanksgiving marathon. While rapid response collecting means collecting everyday items from a pandemic while the pandemic is still happening. So if rapid response collecting is in the moment and hard to plan for, how do we plan for it? There are some things you can do to prepare for the unexpected. And I think this is something that, because the pandemic has really been something that so many people have been experiencing, everybody in the world has been dealing with it in some way, there's a really big mass of people who have been attempting in our field to do really good quality rapid response collecting around it, which means that suddenly we're getting this information about where are the stumbling blocks in a rapid response collection. And so we can kind of figure out a little bit better what can we think about beforehand and what must be left up in the air. So how do we prepare for these things when we don't know they're going to happen? Well, here are a couple of things that you can do to feel at least maybe a little bit more prepared for when it does. One is to make sure your collections management policy addresses contemporary collecting and provides for, or at least doesn't discourage, the collecting of items that might be not be considered old. So just making sure that you don't have anything in your collections management policy that helps people turn away something because it's only 3 days old, but rather that it really kind of addresses the idea of what is considered history. So that can be really important in helping you prepare. Create a plan for active collecting during a rapid response situation. So this we're going to break down a bit more in the next slide. But if you have a plan for rapid response situations, then it's a little bit easier because you have something you can go to that at least gives you some bare bones to start with instead of floundering and feeling like you don't even know where to begin. So also understand that rapid response situations can come with emotional tolls on staff, on volunteers, on your community, whether it's because the staff and volunteers are experiencing the same event as others in the community, such as the pandemic. We've all been trying to collect it while also dealing with our own issues around it and our own changing lifestyles that have happened, or because the event took place, which took place is generally emotionally difficult. So something like a mass shooting, if that's the event that has caused your rapid response collecting to get started, then that is going to have an emotional toll. Even if it's someone who wasn't directly associated with that event, it can still be quite difficult. So have as part of your plan how you will deal with staff and volunteers in these types of situations. So some rapid response collecting situations, like I said, will come with an emotional toll on the staff of the museum doing the collecting. For instance, this is something that I remember very vividly. When I worked many years ago at the Connecticut Historical Society, we started processing items from protests and memorials that came after the Sandy Hook school shootings. Even though I wasn't personally affected by it in the sense of I didn't know any of the victims, I didn't know any of the individuals, but I did have friends whose kids went to that school or who were a little bit more directly affected. And just in general, I think we can all agree that that was a tough thing to handle. So it was extremely hard to handle as the staff as we were going through and processing these things. So consider the fact that the staff, we needed additional support as we processed the collections, dealing with this thing that happened, that was happening now, rather than being something like the Hartford Circus Fire, which was also an incredibly tragic event where many young children passed away, but it had happened in 1940. So me cataloging something from that event wasn't as emotionally fraught because there was distance to it. So knowing that when you're cataloging something from a rapid response collection, there can be sometimes no separation in that emotion. So it's really important to think through how are you going to support your staff. I've heard of a couple museums will give, instead of assigning staff to do the cataloging for contemporary rapid response items, they will ask for volunteers from the staff so that staff can self-select out and say, you know what, I'm too close to this. This is too rough for me. They also, checking in a lot with staff and making sure that they're doing okay, that they need, maybe they just need a break. Maybe for a week, they'd really love to just catalog a whole bunch of ball canning jars. And they don't want to even look at anything from the rapid response. And that's something that you can kind of easily give to them. They can come back to it when they're ready to. So with contemporary collecting, it's more likely to feel like that general flow of everyday life as opposed to that rapid response, like collecting something commemorative from the local athlete who just went to the Olympics or an election campaign yard sign. Although something like a yard sign, the person processing the item might disagree with the candidate it represents, it's usually not as emotionally difficult as processing an item from something more unexpected that happened and called in the rapid response plan. So know as part of that plan, you need to address those emotional pieces. So let's talk about what you should have in that plan. So the idea of rapid response plans as official documents in history organizations is still fairly new. So examples of them are not prolific, but there are some questions you can consider when putting together a plan of your own. Really quickly, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, but I see that there's a lot of questions on this slide, and so I don't want you to think that you have to rapidly write them down. Everyone who is here will receive a recording of the webinar in the next couple of days. So you will be able to come back to this slide to screenshot this, whatever you need to do in order to have the information that we're talking through now. So if you're frantically writing down all of these questions, you'll get them in your inbox, so don't worry too much about it. So some of the things that you can put into this plan: determine who decides when the plan will get activated. Think about who in the institution, not individuals, because people change out of jobs, but job titles. Do you have a collections committee? Is it just the executive director? Is it the curator? Is it the staff members or the volunteers who are serving as those positions? Decide who is going to be the one to activate this rapid response plan. And think about at what point does an event constitute a rapid response, and when is it simply a part of contemporary collecting? What parts of the rapid response plan will be implemented for each particular instance? That's also something to think about. So for instance, think about how you might collect items. Will you do it online? If so, how? Will you do it in person, during the event, immediately after the event? And know that each time the plan is put into place, it will require a decision to be made about how items will be collected. So you'll also want to think about, when you're talking about who's going to decide activating the plan, who is then also going to decide which of these parts are going to be activated. So different parts of the plan might come into play at different times. For instance, early collecting for COVID-19 has happened almost entirely online and during the active pandemic. But in the aftermath of the pandemic, which hopefully comes sooner rather than later, but in the aftermath, we might also be interested in taking things in person and taking physical items. So all of those pieces might eventually come into play, but they're coming into play at different times. There also might be instances where you decide you're only going to collect online or you're only going to collect in person. So think about what best fits the exact situation, but have a basic plan for all of them. Know how you would do an online collecting initiative, even if you don't know what you're trying to collect yet. You can still make some of those decisions. Decide what you need to know about the item and how you will get the information. So what's the story? Will you have a form, an email, what? So I know Mary is going to touch on some of these decisions that IHS made while creating their collecting plan for the pandemic. So she'll give you some ideas about that later. But yeah, it's just thinking about, what do you want to know? What are the things? Sometimes it's easiest to go through and think about, what are the things that you don't know about items currently in your collection that were taken in 75 years ago that you wish you knew? And how are you going to ask those questions now when taking in new items, so that you can make sure that curators in the future don't hate you, and that you give them everything they need. So also think about how many of a specific item you might want, even if you don't know what these items are. So for instance, do you need 10 masks, or will 2 or 3 with some good stories from different types of individuals be adequate? Again, even if you don't know that the thing is masks, you probably can decide that, well, as a museum, you probably don't need more than 2 or 3 of any one item. So it's just kind of making some of those thoughts, and some of those things, kind of as I mentioned in a later bullet, some of those things might just be the exact same as your regular collections policy. You might already have in your collections policy that you don't collect multiples beyond 2. So those are things that they might follow the same, or they might follow a little bit different. You might decide you want a few more items with a rapid response because you can get all of the story than you would with a regular historical collection item. So legal ownership of these items is also something to consider. So I'm going to do my little disclaimer here that I am not a lawyer at all, but I did just want to kind of give some idea of the idea that it's important to know and ensure legal ownership, and that gets passed to the museum. So much of this idea of kind of figuring out how we get legal ownership in a rapid response situation is still being resolved in the museum field, especially because rapid response collecting is still fairly new. But this is just some ideas about what you might need to think about and some choices the museum will need to make as donor relations related to collecting that event. So rapid response collecting sometimes has different protocols when it comes to donors and paperwork. So for instance, if an item is being submitted by the owner, whether digitally, online, or in person, all general protocols for donation should be followed, with the deed of gift being signed or permission for use being outright granted at the time of donation, such as signing an online form, etc. If you can follow your regular way of gaining and ensuring legal ownership, do them. But it's also possible that the museum, if you've physically gone to a rally and you're asking participants for their signs after, or even grabbing a sign that was discarded on the ground, it might make it a little bit more difficult. So this might be a situation where you hand someone your business card or the contact info for the museum and ask them to follow up with you, or ask for their info, but I don't know a lot of protesters who take business cards with them, so it might be easier to be prepared to provide your information. In Indiana specifically, we do have an Indiana museum property law. There are a bunch of other states that also have property laws. I am not familiar with them, but I just know they have them. Quite a few states do. There is a website, I believe it's the Society of American Archivists, you can go to, and they kind of help point you towards if your institution, or if your state rather, has some kind of museum property law. They help point you to it. But for Indiana, again, not a lawyer, but items that are received kind of in that way of having a conversation with someone, if they don't respond back to you, these kinds of things probably would fall most likely under a section for presumed to be gifts to the museum, because you've had those conversations. So luckily, if you're in Indiana, there is some guidance on how to get that legal ownership if it is a different situation. But yeah, it's just something to look into. Check out your state's museum property law. If you don't have one, maybe put together a little group of people to push on your politics to kind of get something like that done, because it's really useful and helpful. So also, when you're thinking about things, think about the parts of the process that are different, like I said, that are different from your normal collections process, but also think about if there are things that are the same. Think about whether or not there are certain things that you can or cannot take because of storage space. Think about if maybe in your general museum, let's say your general collections policy says we don't collect fur, but you're willing to make an exception if your rapid response plan has to do with something dealing with climate change, and someone has used, fur on a sign in order to protest animal cruelty or something of that nature. So think about if there are things that in a rapid response situation you might be willing to collect that you don't normally, or where there are things where it's definitely like, we don't collect vehicles. I don't care what vehicle it is. We just don't collect it. So think about kind of some of those types of things. Also, another thing to think about is if there are any potential community partners that you can call on to assist with the collection or the processing of a rapid response collection. Because if it's a rapid response collection, thinking about the fact that it is just as important to get those items cataloged and made available to the public quickly is just as important as kind of collecting them quickly. So we want to make sure that we don't get these things and then add them to our backlogs. We want to get them and make sure that they become a true part of our collection as quickly as possible. So another thing to consider with all collecting is that there are multiple sides to history, and it's important that organizations responsible for preserving history for the future collect as many sides of the story as they can. This means that organizations cannot let their values determine what is kept for the historical record. There's a lot of discussion, and there has been for the last 20 years, about whether or not museums should be neutral. More museums are pushing to the fact that museums are not neutral situations, but there is a huge difference between having a multifaceted collection that tells a historical story from various points of view and having an organization whose values are neutral and does not take a stance on a divisive topic. So know that those are two different things. In one space, a museum should be neutral in its collecting. In the other, it doesn't always make sense that a museum be totally neutral when something historical is going down, and it really kind of creates a situation where the museum needs to take a stance and stand on whatever they determine is the right side of history. So, for example, a great example of this is President Lincoln's Cottage. They are not neutral at all about slavery and racism and that part in society, where racism and modern slavery fall in society. They're not neutral at all about that. But their collection does need to be neutral because it needs to show both sides of that story in order to support their non-neutral stance. So consider the fact that if you have only one side of the story, it also makes it really hard to be not neutral, because it makes it harder for you to make a valid argument of why you're falling on one side or the other. So when you're collecting, you want to make sure to identify all the sides of the story and clarify what you need to collect. So create a plan for collecting multiple sides. Use your resources. If there are community members or organizations that can help put you in touch with people who can speak to various sides of the story, approach them, find out how they can help connect you to those stories. And it is okay to make it clear that the museum is not neutral, but that its collection is. It's also important to have a plan for collecting multiple sides of the historical narrative because it's important to keep the staff and volunteers of the museum safe. So know that sometimes the only other side of the story that you might be able to capture safely is through publicly available resources. So if all else fails, try to at least capture, newspaper articles about the event that have a different viewpoint, and keep a research reference file of the items that are not actually things that you might want to put into your permanent collection. For instance, maybe you don't want newspaper articles in your permanent collection, but those might be the only thing that represent the other side of the story. So a great example of this is maybe people who do and do not support wearing masks during the pandemic. For someone who supports mask wearing, you might be able to collect a mask of theirs. But for someone who doesn't, or if there's not a lot of that conversation happening in your community, the only thing you might be able to get your hands on that represents that there were two sides of that story is through newspaper articles. That's okay. It's better to have newspaper articles on a national level than to have nothing, so that you can kind of know that there were two sides of the story and have it in the historical record that it wasn't, we don't have one mask because everybody wore masks and it was a great old time. Like, we need to make sure that we have all of those pieces. So one last thing I want to mention before Mary takes us through IHS's collecting of COVID-19 is the idea of communicating all of this to the public. So you need to have a communications plan for your collecting initiative. If your plan is to have the community come to you, know how you will make sure the community knows you want things, how you want them to provide them to you, what you want, what are the kinds of things you're looking for. You need to be able to communicate all of those things. So think about how you would do that. If you'll be out and about in the community, actively looking for collection items, have an elevator pitch that explains why you're interested. And some of these things, like creating the elevator pitch, probably not something you'll be able to do until you know what the rapid response event is that you're collecting. But if you at least know that you're going to need it, it's a little bit easier then to tick it off your list, because you've got this list of things that you'll need to do as soon as you decide to do a rapid response collection. Excuse me. So have an elevator pitch to explain why you're interested, and pick the right people to represent the museum. These individuals should be able to separate their personal desires from those of the museum. So for instance, if the museum decides they want to collect yard signs from their community about the Black Lives Matter movement, it's important that the person approaching community members about those items is able to not get into a personal argument with the possible donor about their personal views on the topic. It is about discussing how the museum as a whole would like to capture all sides of the story. It's not about the individual person's convictions. So whether the person doing the asking supports Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, or All Lives Matter, if the museum is looking to collect each part of that historical story, the person collecting these items also needs to understand the importance of each piece, not just the piece that they personally agree with. So if someone is unable to make that kind of separation when talking to others, consider maybe finding a different representative of the museum to make those asks to the community. So you do want to make sure that someone can speak on behalf of the museum and tout what the museum's values are in that situation, and not kind of muddy it with their own, which might be the same as the museum's. It might not necessarily be, especially when it comes to things that are a little bit more politically fraught. So one interesting thing to consider is that by collecting items and putting them in a museum collection, an item, any item, basically ceases to be used as its originally intended purpose the moment it enters a museum collection. So keep that in mind when you're thinking about what types of things and when you're going to collect them during a rapid response or contemporary situation. This is true for contemporary collecting as much as it is for historical collecting. So the chair in the museum collection is part of the historical record. It's not intended to be sat upon anymore. In the same way, if you collect a yard sign, that person no longer has the ability to put that sign in their front yard. So if you collect a sign from a protest, that protester has to make a new one before the next protest because theirs is now part of the historical record in the museum. This isn't a reason not to collect these items, it's just something to be aware of. So this can be one reason why contemporary collecting through photographs is a great entry point. Take photos of yard signs, take photos of protests with examples of protest signs, but maybe have a plan to collect the actual items later. Or hand out business cards for your organization to some protesters and ask them to contact you when they're done with their sign, because you'd be interested in it for the museum if they're kind of when they're ready to put it in the trash can. So all of these things that we've talked about are literally just the tip of what the museum field is grappling with when it comes to effectively collecting current history. So I am going to hand things over to Mary now, who is going to tell us a little bit about kind of IHS's COVID collecting initiative so that we can use it a little bit as a case study of how some of these things might get put into place. So, and again, we'll do some questions at the end. So Mary, it's all you.
Thanks, Karen. So thanks for attending today. And I'm just going to talk to you a little bit more specifically about how our institution entered into these murky waters of participatory archives, rapid response collecting, contemporary collecting, whatever you want to call it. So next slide, please, Karen. Okay, so I sort of look at this as a participatory archive project. So participatory archives can be a lot of different things. People use it to crowdsource metadata or to crowdsource transcription for digital objects. It could be encouraging community engagement and understanding of a collection. Or in our case with this COVID-19 collecting initiative, this is sort of a community or patron created and sourced collection. So we sort of established this framework and put it out there and waited to see what people gave us. And we're curating it from there. I should also say that part of the project for us, we do have a digital image collection via Content DM through OCLC. And so we're using this tool in collaboration with the collecting initiative in order to quickly show some of the things that we've collected. And you can see the picture over here on the screen is one of the items that we've collected through this initiative. Next slide. Next slide, please.
All right, oh, there it goes. I pushed like 6 buttons. Sorry about that.
Sure. So this was also, we got this idea and started trying to figure out our, rapid response plan right before our state went on lockdown in the middle of March. So when we were thinking about what the goals would be for this project, some things that we were considering were that we wanted to be able to collect journals, photographs, music, audiovisual stuff, poems from our fellow Hoosiers in real time. So we could understand, and in the future, we can understand what it's like to experience a global pandemic. We also wanted to have a project set up in such a way that we could have permissions for use acknowledged upon submission, just to make it easier for us and for our registrar, so we didn't have to sort of like trace back with everyone to get their permissions to use whatever it was that they submitted to us. And like I said, we wanted to have a way for some quick turnarounds so we can share what we've been collecting even while the initiative continues via Content DM. Next slide. So this is just what the landing page looks like for our Documenting COVID-19 project. So if you go to our project website page on the Historical Society's website, this is sort of what you're going to land on. So it sort of gives you reasoning of why we want people to participate, how they can help, why it's important. So this has also been a way for us to make the public understand what our mission here is at the Historical Society, to collect and preserve and educate people about Indiana's history. And so there's a little bit about that on there as well. Next page, next slide. So the next few slides, I'm just going to kind of go through a few different ways that I have seen people doing this sort of like participatory archiving or, rapid response collecting model. So first of all, social media hashtag. So some good things about this, it's user-friendly for people who are social media savvy. It's a truly real-time snapshot of what's going on. It's easy to search for your content because of you would make a unique hashtag for collecting. And then of course there'd be built-in audio-visual text capabilities. Downsides of this, not everyone has access to social media or is comfortable with using social media or using hashtags. There could be some lack of clarity on permissions for use by your institution that's collecting. Also, your institution needs to be savvy enough to be able to run software to capture social media posts and to put them into an archival format for collections. Also, with a social media hashtag, there could be a lack of metadata or descriptive material that comes along with those. But next slide, I'll show you a couple of projects. The DC Public Library has done a social media hashtag rapid collecting project called Archive This Moment DC. So you can look at that hashtag on Twitter and see some of the submissions that we've received. And then also at the bottom of the slide is a link to their website so you can read a little bit more about their project. Next slide. Also, Documenting the Now. This is another great organization that has a lot of resources for preserving social media content if this is something that your institution is interested in pursuing. So again, I put the link to the main page there on this slide as well. Next slide. So a kind of classic or little old school way to collect is mass observation journals. If you've read the latest Erik Larson book, The Splendid and the Vile, he relies a lot on mass observation journals to talk about what it was like to be in Britain during the Blitz. So with mass observation journals, it could be a more democratic means of submission, could be a more common or usually user-friendly than social media for some audiences, depending on who your patrons or population you serve are. Less need for extra software or expertise, depending on the nature of the submissions, if they're analog or digital. Some downsides to this, you kind of have to play a long game of reminding people to both continue participating and to submit what they have been writing over the course of months or a year or however long your project is going. And this could also result in more time on part of the registrar of your institution in completing permissions paperwork. So next slide. These are just a few project examples. Of course, the mass observation website from the UK, which has a really neat online digital archive. And also here in Indiana, the IU Archives is asking people to volunteer to do a mass observation type project as well. And next slide. So another way to collect, and this is actually the way that we decided to do this, is through Google Forms. So with Google Forms, you can set up specific fields to hopefully, if people fill it out fully and are conscientious in what information they're providing, you can receive more consistent metadata and descriptive words from people who are submitting. Also, you can add your permissions to statements directly onto the form, so people can give you permission right away and there would be less follow-up for the institution. Google Forms are fairly user-friendly to set up and also for people who are submitting. It's also free to set up. There's no extra software to purchase. Some cons is that the data collected comes to the end users, which is us, or archives and digitization staff, in a forms document that does take a lot of time to organize and sort for processing. So this is also going to depend on what your digital, born digital processing workflows sort of look like in your institution, or maybe you don't have any, and maybe this is sort of like your guinea pig. Our institution has been working on born digital items and has been slowly like evolving workflow processes about it, but this has definitely kicked it into high gear. So this is sort of our first entirely born digital collection that we're working with. So we're learning as we go a little bit as well. So another thing that we found is the forms doc doesn't link back to each individual image. So depending, like I said, on what your workflow is and what you decide about born digital, it can add more time for assigning new file names for processing. There's also some cost in purchasing storage space for your submissions if you decide to go the route of Google Forms. Next slide. So some of the fields that we use to collect metadata, email address, name, we ask people to tell us what date the object was created. We want to give an idea of location, city, county, state, and then we sort of ask a more open-ended question, which I wish that we would have just added some more specific fields for this instead, now that I'm looking back. Because I think we would have gotten more specific information that way, and it would have been more consistent. But we asked, what else should we know about this object to create context? So we asked if people wanted to identify individuals if they're submitting a photograph, or you know, tell us a little bit about why your family decided to write this poem or write this song or something like that. Next slide, please.
Mary?
Yes.
What if you were going to make some things more specific, what are some of the things you wish you had asked?
I think I would like to be more specific about just have a field for if you're submitting a visual, if you're submitting a photograph, like who are the people in the photograph, or have this, you know, have a little bit of breakdown of, and also maybe a field for like a title for a photograph or something like that, so people could create their own, label things the way that they would like to, rather than us sort of assigning a descriptive title.
Okay, thanks.
Sure. So I've also just put up here our permission statements that we used for the Google form, in case anyone is interested in doing this sort of model. This could be a guide for you for permission statements. And I think that's it.
Excellent. Thank you, Mary. And I did want to mention something else. I was actually, something Mary said made me think of this when she was talking with the journals. One of the things you also might want to consider in your rapid response plan is, I know many of us as collections individuals like to shy away from any kind of donor restrictions. So we like to just have to worry about the restrictions that are like legally put on things. So for instance, certain items need to be need to be used in certain ways or not used in certain ways because they include the names of minors or personal information about minors. So the thing needs to be so old before you release that information. So a lot of us like to try to only have the restrictions that are legally bound, not a donor just saying, well, I'd like you to not publish this for however long. But when you're dealing with a rapid response collection, you might need to think about and consider if this is a time where you would allow donors to put certain kinds of restrictions on their items. So for instance, I know personally, when I journal, I say really personal stuff that I don't want other people to necessarily know, but you might determine that knowing really those kinds of really personal struggles that people were dealing with during a pandemic might be in this situation, or especially if you're talking about something like a mass shooting situation, it might be something where having that information to make available to the public, even if not for 50 years, is better than not having it at all. So that's just something you might want to consider when you're thinking about your rapid response collection is, are there certain types of donor restrictions you would be willing to consider, as opposed to maybe in your normal collection, you wouldn't consider any of them. So just another thing to think about. So we're gonna—
Karen and Mary. Oh,
yes.
Sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna say we're gonna open it up to questions.
So we've got a question. It's, what do you do if you receive something through the online donation portal that you don't want?
So we are currently, everything that comes through, we are accessioning, giving an accession number. We have had things that come through that are generally out of our collection scope. So we've had things that aren't from Indiana, because our collecting initiative did make national news. So we've received submissions from all over the place. Not a lot, but some. And then we do have some that are sort of repetitive and things like that. We are accessioning everything. We are not necessarily putting up everything that we receive on Content DM. And we may not end up keeping everything, depending, in the collection. But because it's getting an accession number, that means it will go through a deaccessioning process like anything else that we've accessioned in the museum, that we decide is not in scope, or for whatever reason we are not able to retain.
So in kind of that same vein too, is when you're thinking about something like that in terms of creating your rapid response policy and plan, would be kind of considering how that accessioning process might be different than normal. So with a lot of historical collections, if you've ever been on one of our webinars or workshops where you've heard me talk about a collecting management policy and the importance of temporary receipts and deeds of gifts and things like that, is because there is an outlined deaccessioning process and there are things you need to follow and things you need to do. It's easier to say no right off the bat than it is to, I guess, change your mind later. But in a situation like a rapid response collecting plan, something to consider is maybe if you're doing things online, maybe it's easier to accession them now and deal with it later. You also don't have the same, we don't have the same historical perspective, so it can be a little bit more difficult to determine right now what we will and will not want, what will or will not end up being a good representation of the event that is happening at the moment, because we don't have that historical perspective yet. So it might be things, you know, maybe in your rapid response plan, maybe something you say is that 25 years, and I just pulled that number out of nowhere, but maybe you say, you know, 25 years after a rapid response collecting initiative took place, we are going to go back through the collection and we're going to put it in our plan that we're going to go back and readdress things and look through things and look at it with some historical perspective to determine what we do want to continue to keep for the future. It can also make a difference with what the material is, like the physical material. So it's a little bit easier. Yes, it takes up a lot of hard drive space potentially, but it's a little bit easier to collect a bunch of digital photos that you might not eventually want than it is to collect 16 chairs that you won't want. Like there's a little bit different issues with storing things. So there might be, you might say if something comes in via our internet form, like Mary said with IHS, that they're just accepting it now and going back through and dealing with that later through the deaccession process. But you might say that, well, when it comes to in-person stuff, we're going to have to do a little bit more thinking through. It's not going to be a yes all the time.
Yeah, you would definitely have more control if it's an in-person process than if you're doing any sort of online, if you're doing collecting via social media hashtag or collecting via Google Forms. Yeah, you're not going to have as much control over what you receive if you're doing like a truly participatory thing.
Yeah. And sometimes that might be something too that you want to just make clear when you're doing that communication with the public. Are you asking for submissions to possibly be put into the museum's permanent collection, or are you conveying to them that it will be part of the museum's permanent collection? So making sure your wording is all correct and kind of what you want to say, which is another reason why we can't plan for what might happen, but it's easier to think through those kinds of things and wordsmith when you're not staring down the barrel of, we have 24 hours to start this initiative. So thinking about some of those things will help to making sure your wording is all thought through.
Yeah, and we made it clear sort of on our collections page for the COVID-19 that what people are submitting, may or may not become part of our permanent collection.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you do, or how do you address sort of donor's remorse? So I'm at a protest, my daughter and I made a sign together. You approach me in the spirit of the moment. I'm like, sure, here it is. Please take it. And a week later, there's another protest and we really want that sign to go to that other protest. Kind of as Karen talked about, you're shortening its life for its intended use. But what do you do if I, as a donor, have donor's remorse?
So that's another one of those situations where it might be worthwhile to kind of think through what is your process going to be. Maybe you determine that when it comes to something like protest, or maybe when it comes to anything that is a rapid response collection. I know one of the things that we do generally as museums when we're doing a collection, we as an LHS encourages a lot, and a lot of museums do this. They have a process that includes a temporary receipt. So if Mary walks in the door to the museum tomorrow, she can drop off her items. We give her a temporary receipt that basically says, like, yes, you dropped off these items, your intention is to provide them to us for the collection, and we all have each other's contact information. And then there's a whole process of how we determine whether or not that item is actually going to come into the permanent collection and be part of that. After that time, which can very easily take a month or so, then we reach out and we provide you a deed of gift if we want to keep the item, which is the point at which the item is legally provided and legally handed over to the institution and becomes the institution's property and no longer yours. So one of the helpful pieces of having that sort of buffer of a month or a couple of months is because it does allow for a little bit of donor remorse. So if in that time you've just been fretting over the fact that, you're not sure that you're quite ready to give grandma's wedding dress to the museum yet, you've really kind of been missing it, you're not sure it was the right decision, we give you an opportunity built into our system for you to say, never mind, I want it back. So one of the things you could consider with rapid response collecting is, although we want to be quick in getting it up and getting it available online, but you might build in a little bit of a buffer before you actually do that permanent paperwork, because it does provide a little bit of a buffer and a little bit of time for the donor to come back and say, you know what, I'm not ready yet. I'm not ready to give you my journals yet. I can't, the more I've been thinking about the possibility of other people reading them, the more I'd like to leave them to you in my will, because I'm not there yet. So that might be one thing. That's certainly something to think through when you're talking about your rapid response plan, is what will you do in those situations? Luckily, when you're submitting things online, usually there's not only one copy of that photograph. So that's helpful.
We've also found, because we use Content DM so much at our institution, we do sometimes have arrangements with donors for loans for digitization. So they may loan us an object or papers or photographs, and they are not ready for us to have it permanently in our collection. But they are perfectly fine with other people being able to access it and use it for research via Content DM. And so we have specific paperwork to do those kinds of things. And so that's also something that could potentially mitigate a donor remorse sort of situation if they're not fully ready.
Yep. I think we've all experienced that probably on both sides of the aisle. Being remorseful about getting rid of something, whether you took it to a museum or to Goodwill, but also being fully ready to part with it. So are there any other questions? I know, like I said at the beginning, I know this is kind of an interesting topic to talk about because we are still so much in the infancy of having these discussions in the museum field. So we will be sending out afterwards, in a couple of days, once Zoom has processed this recording and all of that, we will send you out a link, and I'll include in that email a couple of links to some organizations that are doing rapid response collecting or did for COVID-19, have started them. That might just give you some ideas of kind of how they answered those questions about the plan and how they put different things into practice, because different museums are doing it different ways. The Victoria and Albert Museum has had a rapid response collecting initiative for a while. Now, they use the term basically as a contemporary collecting term, but there's a bunch of places that we can still learn from, because there's a lot that has been yet to be determined. But you'll get some of those links, and I'll include also the links that Mary had in her presentation so that you can go check those things out as well. All right. Tamara, I don't see any more questions. Have I missed any?
No, but could you put up the contact slide so people can see your email address?
That's right. I do have one of those. So if, as you're thinking this through, if you watch the recording, or if you aren't actively participating now and you're only watching the recording and this is the first time you're hearing us, here's all our contact information. This is mine and Mary's. Feel free to reach out to either one of us with any questions you have, any follow-up you have. As Local History Services, one of the things we also provide to our constituents here in Indiana is, if you are writing a plan, if you want us to take a look at that or kind of provide feedback, we're happy to do so. We're happy to have further discussions about this. If you're not in Indiana, I would suggest heading to the American Association of State and Local History website. It's aaslh.org. Under the, now I'm forgetting, I have it bookmarked, so I never remember where it is. But I think under the groups that they have, there is a group called the Field Services Alliance. A lot of different, it's Affinity Communities. Thanks, Jeanette. So under the Affinity Communities tab, you'll see one for Field Services Alliance, or FSA. In that is a listing of all the field services groups. That's what Local History Services is. We're a field services office. So under that tab, you can find if there's a field services organization in your state. Not all states have them, but many states do. So, you know, if you're interested in finding out what your local field services group can do in helping you set up a rapid response or contemporary collecting initiative, reach out to them, reach out to that FSA group and see kind of how they can help you.
All right, we don't have any other questions, but
Perfect.
thank you, Mary and Karen. That was an awesome presentation.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I hope that it was useful and that you learned a couple of things and got more questions than answers, but hopefully the right questions. So we will hopefully see you all soon in a future webinar, and until then, stay safe.
Thank you, everyone.